Here at Production Hell, I've covered all manner of cinematic screw-ups, from disorganised shoots to clashing personalities, natural disasters, punishing work conditions, ego-driven actors, conflicting visions, and lack of creative direction. But there's one man whose movies stand head and shoulders above all the rest, a man whose name has become infamous amongst the most perfectionist and eccentric of Hollywood directors. The man in question is Stanley Kubrick, and the movie in this case is his magnum opus on the Vietnam War, Full Metal Jacket. Now, you don't need me to tell you that Kubrick movies have a long history of difficult productions, but I think Full Metal Jacket might just take the cake for its weird decision to bring Vietnam to southeast England, its gruelling year-long shoot, and all the little dramas and iconic moments that it spawned. So grab your rifle, Marine, and let's get some! By the early 1980s, with The Shining finally finished, Stanley Kubrick was on the hunt for ideas for his next film. For a while, he considered adapting Dream Story, an obscure novella by Arthur Schnitzler that he'd been obsessed with for decades but never managed to crack, or Super Toys Last All Summer Long, another obscure little short story about a robotic boy trying to earn his mother's love that he'd been tinkering with since the early 70s. As it turned out though, the time wasn't right for Dream Story, which would have to wait another 20 years to eventually become Eyes Wide Shut. And as for Super Toys, that film would need a couple of decades as well, and a new director before it finally saw the light of day. Instead, he returned to one of the key themes of his career: war. In this case, the Vietnam War, which was going through a bit of a renaissance in the public consciousness at the time. The Vietnam War was gradually being reframed as a noble cause that almost succeeded, and even the action movies of the time were literally trying to rewrite the war with a happier ending.
Do we get to win this time?
This time it's up to you.
Kubrick decided he wanted his own take on Vietnam, not as some existential journey into the human psyche like Apocalypse Now, or some cheesy action flick starring Chuck Norris, but a more realistic take on what it was actually like for the young men being fed into the war machine. For this, he eventually chose the novel The Short Timers, about the experiences of real-life Marine Gustav Hasford, from basic training all the way up to his deployment in Vietnam. He had a story, and now all he needed to do was adapt it into a screenplay, but in typical Stanley Kubrick fashion, nothing was ever easy, and in this case he chose to contact his friend Michael Herr, who had served in Vietnam himself and written his own book about his experiences. Herr was reluctant to revisit the memories of Vietnam again, but Kubrick was adamant that he had to be the one, and it took him 3 years to finally persuade the guy to sign up. Damn, that's determination right there. With her finally working on the main draft of the screenplay, Kubrick also enlisted Hasford himself to help out, without telling either man that the other was working on it. This was actually a pretty common tactic of his, because he believed that people produced their best work in isolation rather than collaboration, and he could then pick and choose the best elements of both screenplays to make some kind of master script. It didn't work out too well for him in this case, because Hasford eventually got pissed off that he didn't get proper writing credit, and even threatened to sue the production unless he got his way. On that subject actually, Kubrick was keen to meet with Hasford in person so he could get a sense of the guy, and invited him round to his house for dinner one night. Herr advised him against it, knowing that Kubrick was shy, thoughtful and soft-spoken, and Hasford was, to put it bluntly, a scary man, a big haunted Marine. The meeting went about as well as you might expect, and Kubrick never met with him again.
Not a great plan.
Anyway, by 1985, the script was finally ready and it was time to scout locations. Now, you might think that a movie set in the jungles of Vietnam would be filmed in, well, Vietnam, or at the very least, another Southeast Asian country that could double for it. Kubrick, however, had different ideas. His crippling fear of flying, combined with a general reluctance to travel far from home, left the crew with only one option: Vietnam would have to come to England. As luck would have it though, his location scouts were actually able to find a disused chemical plant a few miles from central London that was due to be demolished anyway, and just so happened to resemble the Vietnamese city of Hue. His set designers then went to work, carefully blowing up and demolishing parts of the plant to make it look like a city under siege. An entire plastic jungle was manufactured in America to give the place a more tropical feel, only for Kubrick to decide that he didn't like the look of it, and instead had live trees flown in from Spain. A British army base in Hertfordshire doubled as the Marines' training camp, and a lot of the background extras that you see in the movie are actual British soldiers. Casting would also prove to be a challenge. Kubrick was annoyed at war films and their tendency to cast actors in their 20s and 30s as frontline soldiers when the average fighting man was aged just 19. And so a hunt was launched to find suitable actors to play the Marine recruits. Unfortunately, most of the teenage actors who auditioned were far too immature for their parts, eventually forcing him to go with guys in their 20s anyway. Matthew Modine, then 26, ended up being cast as Private Joker after Kubrick considered Bill McKinney for the role, only to decide that he was terrified of the guy after his performance in Deliverance. I mean, I can't say I blame him. I wouldn't want to be left alone in a room with that guy either. Modine also suggested his good friend Vincent D'Onofrio to play the overweight and slow-witted Private Pio. D'Onofrio wasn't overweight or stupid, but he impressed Kubrick enough to get the part and ended up gaining about 70 pounds for the role. The character of Animal Mother was created as a direct response to the big 80s muscle men who were gunning down entire on-screen armies at the time. There was apparently serious talk of casting Arnold Schwarzenegger in the role for a while.
Wrong.
Fuck me, talk about on-the-nose casting. I mean, much as I love the idea of Stanley Kubrick trying to coax the perfect performance out of Arnold for hundreds of takes, I think it might have undermined the film's credibility a little bit. But the biggest headache was the part of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. The role originally went to Tim Colchieri, but it soon became obvious that the guy wasn't taking it seriously enough, and his performance came across as comical rather than intimidating. But cometh the hour, cometh the man, and in this case, the man happened to be legendary R. Lee Ermey, a minor technical advisor on the movie who just so happened to be a former US Marine drill instructor. Wow, that was lucky. Ermey asked if he could try out for the role and promptly launched into a storm of abuse against a bunch of helpless extras. Most of what he said was so explicit that it could never have been used in the actual movie, but the point was made all the same. Kubrick was so impressed that he cast him immediately, and in that moment, one of the most iconic characters in cinema history was born. With the casting settled, principal photography began in August 1985, with the Vietnam battle scenes due to be shot first, and this is where the problems really began. First and foremost was Kubrick himself, whose pursuit of the perfect take was already infamous in Hollywood. The problem was that he was never great at articulating what he actually wanted from his actors, and so his solution was to just keep shooting until he eventually got what he wanted through sheer repetition. This approach resulted in more than a few meltdowns over the years, especially during The Shining, where he forced his poor actors to do the same scene 148 times. The man basically refused to move on until he was 100% satisfied, and considering they were shooting on location with dozens if not hundreds of extras, tempers soon started to fray. He was also pretty much incapable of making a decision and sticking to it, and so the script ended up being reworked and refined constantly throughout the shoot. Even the ending wasn't decided until the 11th hour. The original treatment would have seen Joker get killed and finish up with his funeral, and it was only Modine who persuaded him to change it. All these various delays were compounded by the British film crew and their, unique ways of working, which mandated tea breaks every couple of hours, even if they were right in the middle of an important shot, which naturally didn't sit well with a hard-driving director like Kubrick.
You mean you had a tea break at 4 o'clock? And you have a tea break at 6 o'clock?
No, this is a fresh tea break. He came up to me and said the tea's here.
No, but if you had a tea break at 4, you don't have to break for this tea break. This must just be a complimentary tea break. If you broke for tea at 4, you don't have to break for tea at 6, at quarter to 7, then break for a meal at 7:30. So figure it out.
The location for the battle scenes was also turning out to be less than optimal. It turns out that a disused chemical plant isn't the best environment to shoot a war movie in. The ground was saturated with decades worth of chemicals and toxins that had never been cleaned up, and in the summer heat it turned into a kind of grainy, wind-blown dust that got into everything. Clothes, hair, camera equipment, lungs. Pretty soon cast and crew were coming down with all kinds of mysterious illnesses that lingered for weeks on end, and according to Kubrick's family, his health never fully recovered from the shoot. As photography dragged on and the summer heat gave way to autumn rain, the muddy ground turned into a weird rainbow-coloured sludge that nobody wanted to go near. The dilapidated buildings also proved to be a problem as the shoot went on. Many of them were unstable after being demolished and turned into a war zone for months on end, and some of them were starting to lean dangerously by the ends. The Viet Cong sniper that gets gunned down in the climactic showdown was played by a teenage girl from London that had never acted before. After shooting her death scene, Kubrick wanted to do another take, because of course he fucking did, and so he showed her a rough cut of the scene to review her performance. Unfortunately, she wasn't prepared for it, and she was so traumatized that she ran out of the room sobbing and refused to do any more. Needless to say, Kubrick's reshoot never happened. All was not well with the rest of the cast either. Modine and D'Onofrio might have started out as good friends, but the relationship gradually soured as the shoot wore on, and their conflicting acting styles rubbed each other the wrong way. The two men gradually stopped talking to each other and eventually almost came to blows several times. If you watch the scene where the recruits give Private Pyle a blanket party, you can see Modine really lay into him, pause for a second, and then give him a couple more lumps for good measure. That wasn't acting, he just really wanted to hurt the guy. Production also had to be shut down again when Ermi crashed his car and broke all the ribs down one side of his chest, and it was 4 months before he was finally back in action. Principal photography was originally intended to last 4 or 5 months, but ended up taking almost an entire year, to the point where some of the actors had to drop out of other roles as production dragged on, which didn't exactly do any favours for morale. Matthew Modine almost missed the birth of his son after Kubrick refused to let him leave the set. Luckily for him though, he had the perfect solution. "Stanley," he announced, "I've got a knife in my pocket, and if you don't let me go right now, I'm gonna cut myself bad enough that I have to go to hospital anyway." Apparently he was mad enough that even Kubrick had the good sense to back down on the agreement that Modine would be back on set as soon as the birth was over. But even when he did come back, he actually berated the poor guy for choosing a shit name for his son. Damn man, that's brutal. Filming finally wrapped in August 1986, after which the movie went into the usual tortuous editing process, overseen every step of the way by Kubrick himself. Although it proved to be a financial success when it finally released in the summer of '87, taking in 120 million worldwide, it wasn't quite the blockbuster hit that Kubrick had been hoping for. Movies like Platoon had beaten him to the punch and offered a more accessible window into Vietnam. That being said, Full Metal Jacket is still widely regarded as one of the greatest war movies ever made, and it provides a uniquely unsettling insight into the dehumanization and brutality of warfare and the machine that feeds young men into it. The making of this movie might have been almost as torturous as the war itself, but the end result more than justifies all the blood, sweat and tears that went into its creation. Full Metal Jacket is a war movie unlike any other, and if somehow you still haven't experienced it, I can heartily recommend that you give it a go. Oh yeah, and just a little reminder that the Critical Drinker and Critical Doggo plushies are still available to pre-order for the next few days, but once they're gone, so if you're gonna do it, now's probably a good time. Anyway, the link will be in the description. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.